Something extraordinary just unfolded in the Caribbean that Washington doesn't want you thinking about too carefully. Venezuelan fighter jets approached a United States warship operating near their territorial waters, and what happened next reveals everything about the crumbling mythology of American military supremacy. For decades, we've been told that US naval power is untouchable, that our warships sail wherever they please, that no nation dares challenge American military presence in their region. But here's what they're not telling you. Venezuela, a country we've sanctioned into economic devastation, a nation we've attempted to regime change multiple times, just demonstrated they won't be intimidated in their own backyard. The Venezuelan military tracked that warship, scrambled their fighters, and forced a tactical decision that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. This incident isn't just about one confrontation. It's a symptom of a larger transformation happening across the global south. Nations are done accepting American military encirclement as normal. They're done pretending that US warships cruising their coastlines represents freedom of navigation rather than intimidation. What happened when those fighters closed in? Let's examine what this tells us about the real balance of power today. The United States Navy has operated for generations under an assumption that has become so deeply embedded in our strategic thinking that we rarely even articulate it anymore. That assumption is simple. American warships can go wherever they want, whenever they want, and nobody can do anything about it. We call it freedom of navigation. We dress it up in legal language about international waters. We invoke centuries-old maritime law traditions. But at its core, this assumption rests not on law, but on raw power. It rests on the belief that our military superiority is so overwhelming, so total, so unchallengeable, that even thinking about confronting a US naval vessel is an act of suicidal irrationality. For a very long time, that assumption held. It held through the Cold War, even when the Soviet Union maintained a formidable navy. It held through the unipolar moment after the Soviet collapse, when American military dominance seemed almost supernatural. It held through the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, through drone strikes in Pakistan and Yemen, through military operations across Africa and Asia. The world learned to accept American warships as a permanent feature of the global landscape, like weather patterns or ocean currents, something to be observed and endured but never challenged. But something has been shifting beneath the surface of international relations, something profound that doesn't always make headlines but represents a fundamental reorganization of global power. Venezuela's decision to scramble fighter jets in response to a US warship operating near their waters is not an isolated incident of one nation's bravado. It's a signal, a data point in a much larger pattern that suggests the era of uncontested American military presence around the world is entering a new phase. Now, before we go further, let's be clear about what actually happened here, because the details matter enormously. A United States warship was conducting what the Navy calls a freedom of navigation operation in waters that Venezuela considers within their sphere of territorial concern. The exact location matters legally, of course. International law recognizes different maritime zones with different rules. There's territorial waters extending 12 nautical miles from a coast where a nation's sovereignty is nearly absolute. Then there's the contiguous zone extending to 24 nautical miles where nations can enforce certain laws. Beyond that lies the exclusive economic zone, stretching 200 nautical miles, where nations have rights over natural resources, but not general sovereignty. And finally, there's the high seas, where freedom of navigation is supposed to reign supreme. The United States has long conducted operations designed to challenge what it views as excessive maritime claims by other nations. The Navy's Freedom of Navigation program explicitly seeks to demonstrate that America does not recognize certain territorial assertions, that we will sail our ships through disputed waters to make a legal and military point. It's a policy that sounds principled when you describe it in those terms, a defense of international law and open seas. But here's what that analysis conveniently omits. These freedom of navigation operations are never conducted near American shores. We're not seeing Chinese warships regularly cruising 12 miles off the coast of California to make legal points about maritime law. We're not seeing Russian destroyers conducting exercises in the Gulf of Mexico to demonstrate their commitment to freedom of navigation. This is a prerogative that only the dominant naval power claims, and it's a prerogative that increasingly looks less like law enforcement and more like intimidation. When those Venezuelan fighters scrambled and closed in on that American warship, the crew faced a decision that illuminates the complexity of modern military encounters. They could continue their operation, essentially daring the Venezuelan pilots to do something aggressive, gambling that Venezuela wouldn't risk an international incident by firing on a US vessel. They could accelerate their mission and leave the area quickly, which might look like backing down, but would avoid escalation. Or they could adopt a defensive posture, tracking the Venezuelan aircraft and preparing countermeasures while neither advancing nor retreating. According to the information that has emerged, the warship chose not to press forward aggressively. The Venezuelan fighters made their point. We see you, we're not afraid of you, and we're willing to put our pilots in the air to demonstrate that your presence here is not welcome and not uncontested. And the American vessel, rather than escalating toward potential combat, completed its operation and departed the area. Now, if you're getting your news from mainstream American media, this incident probably barely registered. If it was covered at all, it was likely presented as a minor encounter, routine posturing, nothing to see here. But that framing misses the revolutionary nature of what just occurred. 20 years ago, the idea that Venezuela would scramble fighters in response to a US warship would have been treated as laughable. Venezuela, the country that sells oil, the country that we could economically strangle with sanctions whenever we chose, the country whose military we could overwhelm in a matter of days if we decided to, that Venezuela is now willing to directly confront American military power in its region. And the US military is choosing not to escalate that confrontation into armed conflict. That represents a shift, a crack in the edifice of American military supremacy that has implications far beyond the Caribbean. Let's think about why this matters in the broader context of global power structures, because this isn't really about one warship or one encounter. For decades, American foreign policy has rested on a foundation of military omnipresence. We maintain more than 700 military bases in approximately 80 countries. We have carrier strike groups that can project devastating military power to any corner of the globe within days. We spend more on our military than the next 10 countries combined. This military infrastructure serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It protects American economic interests abroad. It provides security guarantees to allied nations. It enables rapid military intervention when Washington deems it necessary. And perhaps most importantly, it sends a psychological message to every government on earth. American power is inescapable. Resistance is futile. Accommodation is the only rational choice. But that psychological message only works if it's never seriously tested. It only works if nations believe that challenging American military presence will result in swift and devastating consequences. It only works if the cost of resistance appears infinitely higher than the cost of compliance. And that's where Venezuela's action becomes so significant. They tested the premise, they scrambled their fighters, they approached an American warship in a manner that could have triggered military engagement. And nothing catastrophic happened to them. The warship didn't sink their fighters out of the sky. The United States didn't launch retaliatory strikes against Venezuelan military installations. There was no immediate economic punishment beyond the sanctions already in place. Venezuela demonstrated that direct military confrontation with American forces doesn't automatically result in national annihilation, and every country in the global south was watching. This connects to a much larger transformation happening in international relations that often gets obscured by the day-to-day noise of news cycles. For 3 decades after the Cold War ended, the United States operated in what some called a unipolar moment. Soviet power had collapsed, China had not yet risen to great power status, Europe was content to follow American leadership, and the developing world seemed to have no choice but to accept whatever terms Washington offered. International institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank operated essentially as extensions of American economic policy, imposing structural adjustment programs that opened developing economies to Western capital while dismantling their domestic industries. The World Trade Organization codified rules that advantaged American corporations while preventing developing nations from using the same industrial policies that America itself had employed during its own development. And over all of this hung the implicit threat of American military power, the understanding that nations which resisted this economic order too aggressively might find themselves on the receiving end of sanctions, coups, or military intervention. But that unipolar moment is ending, and it's ending not because of any single event, but because of the accumulated weight of multiple trends all pushing in the same direction. China's economic rise has created an alternative pole of global power, not just militarily, but economically and technologically. Chinese infrastructure investment through initiatives like the Belt and Road has given developing nations options they didn't have before. That to finance development projects without accepting IMF conditions, the ability to build relationships with a great power that isn't constantly threatening regime change. Russia, despite its much smaller economy, has demonstrated repeatedly that it will use military force to protect what it considers its sphere of influence, most dramatically in Ukraine, but also in Syria and elsewhere, and perhaps most significantly, a coalition of nations that we somewhat clumsily call the Global South has begun to find its voice and its leverage. These nations look at the global economic system and see a rigged game. They see that commodity prices for their exports, things like oil and agricultural products and minerals, are subject to wild fluctuations, while the prices of manufactured goods they must import from the West remain stubbornly high. They see that the US dollar's role as the global reserve currency allows America to print money to solve its problems, while their own currencies collapse if they attempt the same thing. They see that Western nations industrialized using protectionist policies and now demand that developing countries embrace free trade. They see climate change caused primarily by Western industrialization threatening their populations, while Western nations offer inadequate aid and resist serious emissions reductions. And they see American military forces stationed in their regions not for their protection, but to ensure their compliance. Venezuela's confrontation with that American warship needs to be understood in this context. Venezuela has been under crushing American sanctions for years now. These sanctions are ostensibly about human rights and democracy, but let's be honest about what they really represent. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia. For decades, Western oil companies had access to those reserves on favorable terms. Then Hugo Chavez came to power and changed the arrangement, demanding a larger share of oil revenues for the Venezuelan state, using those revenues to fund social programs, and generally refusing to accept the role of compliant oil supplier to Western markets. The United States responded first with an attempted coup in 2002, then with years of economic warfare designed to strangle the Venezuelan economy and turn the population against their government. Those sanctions have caused genuine suffering. Venezuela's economy contracted dramatically. Hyperinflation destroyed people's savings. Shortages of basic goods became common, and millions of Venezuelans fled the country seeking better opportunities abroad. American policymakers openly stated that the goal was to make the Venezuelan economy scream, to create conditions so intolerable that Venezuelans would overthrow their government and install a leadership more amenable to American interests. It's a strategy that has been employed repeatedly throughout Latin America's history, from Chile in the 1970s to Nicaragua in the 1980s to Venezuela today. And it's a strategy that treats entire populations as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of geopolitical goals. But here's what's remarkable. Despite years of this economic warfare, despite attempted coups and sanctions and diplomatic isolation, Venezuela hasn't collapsed into the kind of failed state that would allow for easy American intervention. Instead, Venezuela has survived by diversifying its relationships, by deepening ties with China and Russia and Iran, by finding alternative markets for its oil, and by developing a kind of siege mentality that frames resistance to American pressure as a matter of national dignity and sovereignty. And now we see Venezuela willing to directly confront American military power in its own region, secure in the knowledge that the United States has limited options for retaliation that wouldn't be wildly disproportionate and wouldn't risk escalating into a conflict that America doesn't actually want. This is where we need to talk about the gap between American military capacity and American military utility. The United States absolutely has the military power to devastate Venezuela. We could destroy their air force, sink their navy, cripple their infrastructure, and occupy their territory if we chose to commit the resources. But that capacity exists in a vacuum of political will and strategic coherence. The American public has no appetite for another military adventure in Latin America. Our recent interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated that military victory in the initial combat phase doesn't translate into political success or stability. The international community, even American allies, would view an invasion of Venezuela as naked aggression, especially given that Venezuela poses no threat to American territory or citizens. And perhaps most importantly, such an intervention would accelerate the very trends in global politics that most threaten American dominance, the formation of a genuine alternative bloc of nations united not by ideology, but by opposition to American hegemony. So Venezuela can scramble its fighters and approach American warships because they've calculated correctly that the United States won't escalate to full military confrontation over such incidents. They're calling America's bluff, and in doing so, they're revealing that much of American military power is more symbolic than functional. It exists, it's real, it's devastating, but it can't actually be used in most situations without costs that exceed any conceivable benefits. This is the paradox of hegemonic power in the 21st century. You can have the strongest military in world history and still find that it doesn't give you the ability to shape events the way you want. Now let's connect this to the broader question of global morality, because that's really what's at stake here. The international order constructed after World War II was built on certain principles, at least nominally. Sovereignty matters. Nations have the right to self-determination. Military aggression is illegal. Might doesn't make right. But the actual practice of international relations has consistently violated these principles, and the violator in chief has been the United States. We've overthrown democratically elected governments in Iran, Guatemala, Chile, and elsewhere. We've invaded countries in violation of international law. We've imposed economic sanctions that cause civilian suffering to achieve political goals. We've maintained a global network of military bases that we would never tolerate if another country tried to establish them near our borders. And we've done all of this while claiming to be defenders of freedom and international law. This hypocrisy hasn't gone unnoticed by the rest of the world. When American officials lecture other nations about respecting sovereignty, those nations remember America's role in Iraq. When we talk about the rules-based international order, they remember that we refused to join the International Criminal Court and passed a law authorizing military force to free any American held by that court. When we condemn other nations for human rights violations, they remember Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib and our drone strike program that has killed thousands of civilians. The moral authority that America claims in international affairs has been steadily eroding for decades, and that erosion has consequences. What Venezuela did when those fighters closed in on that American warship was reject the premise of American moral authority. They rejected the idea that the United States has some special right to send military forces into their region. They rejected the narrative that American military presence represents stability and order rather than threat and intimidation. And they did so publicly, visibly, in a way that other nations can observe and potentially emulate. This is how hegemonies decline, not usually through dramatic military defeats, but through the slow accumulation of challenges and resistance, through the gradual revelation that the emperor has no clothes, that the threatening giant is actually constrained by its own contradictions and limitations. We're living through a moment of profound transition in the global order, and most Americans aren't even aware it's happening. Our media focuses on domestic political theater, on scandals and personalities and cultural conflicts, while largely ignoring the tectonic shifts occurring in international relations. But these shifts will ultimately matter far more to American prosperity and security than most of the things that dominate our news cycles. The ability of the United States to run massive trade deficits depends on the dollar's role as reserve currency, and that role is being challenged by nations increasingly willing to trade in alternative currencies. The willingness of other nations to accept American leadership depends on the perception that such leadership benefits them, and that perception is evaporating. The effectiveness of American military power depends on other nations believing we're willing to use it, and that belief weakens with every confrontation we choose not to escalate. None of this means that American power is about to collapse or that we're witnessing the imminent end of American influence. Hegemonic transitions take decades, sometimes generations, but the direction of change is becoming clear. We're moving from a world where American preferences largely determine global outcomes to a world where American power is one force among several, where other nations have meaningful alternatives, where resistance to American demands becomes thinkable and sometimes profitable. And incidents like Venezuelan fighters approaching a US warship aren't just interesting military encounters, they're symptoms of this larger transformation. They're moments when the changing balance of power becomes visible, when the gap between American pretensions and American capabilities gets exposed, when other nations test the boundaries of what's possible and discover that those boundaries are softer than they appeared. The question Americans need to be asking is what kind of role we want to play in this emerging multipolar world. Do we try to maintain dominance through increasingly aggressive military and economic policies, risking conflicts we might not win and certainly can't afford? Do we double down on the strategies of hegemony even as they become less effective and more costly? Or do we adapt, accepting that we can't control global outcomes the way we once did, and focusing instead on building genuine partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than subordination? Do we continue to lecture the world about democracy and human rights while maintaining a global military empire, or do we actually align our actions with our stated values? These are the real questions that Confrontation in the Caribbean raises, not whether Venezuelan pilots were being aggressive or whether the Navy handled the situation correctly, but what it tells us about where we are in history and where we're headed. Because the world that's emerging, the world where Venezuelan fighters can challenge American warships without triggering catastrophic retaliation, is a world where American exceptionalism is becoming just another nation's mythology. It's a world where other countries have options and agency and the ability to say no to Washington. And it's a world that Americans need to understand and prepare for, because clinging to outdated assumptions about our global role will only make the transition more painful and dangerous. The era of unquestioned American military supremacy is ending not with a bang, but with 1,000 small confrontations, each one revealing the limits of power that once seemed limitless.